Alright, question for you guys. Is this alive? How about this? Or this? Now, what about this? Well, it might seem simple at first to differentiate between, say, a dog and a rock. When it comes to defining what's alive and what isn't, the deeper we look, the more complicated it gets. A big thing that I see over and over in the comments section from creationists in particular is something along the lines of, "Oh, you're an idiot, you believe life came from a rock? We all know it's impossible for life to come from non-life, you dummy." Which is kind of ironic, considering these are the same people that believe humanity was born from literal dust. Now, when it comes to evolution, evolution does not claim that life came from rocks. Not even a little bit. That is inaccurate, and it's a lot more complicated than that. But before we get into that, I want to go right back to the beginning and look at what it means to be alive. What defines something as a living thing? Back in the day, my first memories of learning about life and what it means to be alive were based around these 7 life processes back when I was in primary school. We called these Mrs. Nerg. Some people teach it as Mrs. Gren, but I prefer Mrs. Nerg because it sounds sillier, and I'm just a child at heart, really. The idea is that apparently there are 7 life processes which tell us whether a thing is alive or not. These are movement, reproduction, sensitivity, nutrition, excretion, respiration, and growth. Mrs. Nerg, although why she's married, I don't know. You can be a strong, independent woman and not be married. It is a really nice, basic way of looking at things. It's a nice way to teach kids, but also it's still kind of relevant and we can still apply it to the more complex stuff. We know a dog's alive because it takes in nutrients, respires, and then excretes the waste products. They use the energy created to move around, they have sensors which can pick up on external stimuli, they reproduce babies which grow. So, by Mrs. Nerg standards, a dog is alive. Compare that to a rock, which doesn't take in nutrients or respire. It doesn't excrete waste products or grow or produce offspring or have sensors. A rock is not alive. Even if we draw a face on it, you're not alive. Sorry, rock. It might seem to get a little bit more complicated with something like a plant, but again, apply all the 7 processes as Mrs. Nerg to a plant, and you'll see that they do all of these things. Even movement. There are some plants which will literally open and close depending on environmental conditions, for example, depending on where the sun is, what the weather's like, if it's raining, if they sense a fly near them. There are some that even turn to face the sun. Movement, right? Okay, so a plant is alive, an animal is alive, we get that. What about something smaller, like viruses? Well, it turns out viruses can't reproduce by themselves without a host cell to use, so they aren't classified as living things in their own right. But what about bacteria? Is bacteria alive? Well, yes, simply. Yes, they are. Some bacteria can move using flagella or pili. They respire, although it's usually anaerobically, as opposed to animals which respire aerobically. They have different ways of gathering nutrients and excreting waste from plants and animals, but they still do it. It still happens. Reproduction generally tends to be asexual, but still reproduction. So, okay, yeah, bacteria are alive. Cool. Although what I find interesting is that when I look up the concept of growth in bacteria, it doesn't really refer to the individual cells growing or changing in any kind of way. It tends to refer to population growth, which I found very interesting. So this then leads me to ask, okay, like, what level of complexity should we really be looking at when we talk about life and being alive and living things? When we talk about growth in humans, we talk about a child or a baby growing into an adult, producing new cells and so on. When we talk about plants, again, we mean replication of cells in the organism to make it grow taller or bigger or flower or whatever. But in bacteria, the single bacterium cell doesn't exactly grow. It just is. There is replication of cells, but that's via asexual reproduction. That's whole new, I guess, organisms being made, not just the growth of one living organism. So this is where Mrs. Nerg starts to get a little bit more complicated. I guess the point I'm trying to get at is that it's not quite so simple and straightforward. There are slightly different criteria for different kinds of life. Not that I want to use that creationist term, but you know what I mean. And it does kind of get me asking more questions too, like, if a single-celled organism like a bacteria can be alive, then what about a single human cell? Is a human cell alive, or does it have to be part of the organism before it becomes alive? And if we say, okay, yeah, well, no, all human cells are alive, what about the human cells that don't fulfill all of the 7 Mrs. Nerg criteria? Like red blood cells, for example. yeah, you can argue they like move around the blood and stuff like that, but they don't exactly grow, they don't replicate, there's no mitochondria, so they can't respire, they don't contain a nucleus or DNA or RNA, so there's no replication. By the 7 criteria of Mrs. Nerg, red blood cells aren't alive, but they're human cells, so at what point do a bundle of cells in some organisms become alive, when a single cell can be alive in other organisms? I mean, look at a human, for example. We know that a human being is living. I am living right now, right here. But what about my organs? Are they living? Are they alive? Or are they just a part of the living organism? What about my tissues, my cells, the organelles inside those cells? Are they living, or are they just building blocks of something that is living? I mean, let's look at this in a bit more detail, right? There are several well-defined levels of complexity in the world. You have big ecosystems, which are made up of communities, which are made up of populations, which are made up of organisms. An organism is a living thing, so, for example, a human, a dog, a plant, a tree. Organisms are generally made up of organ systems, which are made up of organs, which are made up of tissues, which are made up of cells. Inside every cell, you have a bundle of organelles, which are made up of macromolecules, and they're made up of atoms. Everything can be, I guess, reduced right back down to those tiny, tiny little atoms. Ecosystems, communities, populations, they aren't living things in their own rights, but they are groups made up of living things. And then you've got the definitely living things, the organisms, and then you have that foggy area between organ systems and organelles, where you're not quite sure if they're alive or if they're just a part of a living thing. That's where it gets complicated. But then you break it down further and you finally get the definitely non-living stuff like macromolecules and atoms. The point to really take away from this, though, is that all living stuff is made up of non-living stuff. Let's focus on a few bits in a bit more detail, right? Let's look at organelles in cells. Organelles are specialized structures within cells that carry out certain functions. For example, you have the nucleus in a cell, mitochondria, ribosomes, so on. These are made up of macromolecules like proteins, lipids, carbohydrates, nucleic acids, and the macromolecules are made up of atoms, which are also exactly what make up literally everything in the universe. Which is kind of where it gets complicated, because if we're all made up of the same things, atoms with protons and neutrons and electrons, if we're all made up of those same things, then what is the difference between living and non-living, really? Where do we draw the line? It's all very complicated, and it all leads me back to this creationist claim of life can't come from non-life, which I think we've just proven is entirely false, because we know that life is made up of non-life. And I mean, what exactly do creationists mean by this? Why do they think this? Because let's be honest, I am made up of non-living atoms right now, but through a series of chemical reactions, they somehow make me living. So when they say that life can't come from non-life, I'd really like to know what they think they mean by that, because it's clearly false. But this idea that a series of chemical reactions can somehow take non-living matter and make it living, this is the basis of all life. Chemistry. It's all to do with how atoms react to each other, and I find that kind of amazing and incredible. Everything we do and say and think, every action, everything we see, it can all be traced back to chemistry. Elements and atoms interact with each other based on their structures. There's no agent deliberately putting them together or telling them what to do. Instead, it's just to do with atoms wanting to be as stable as possible. Although again, perhaps using the word wanting is a misleading word. Even to say aiming for, needing, looking for, it all implies some kind of reason or thought process or agency behind it, and there's not. It's just basic forces working. Atoms generally are most stable when they have this full outer shell of electrons, so they bond with other atoms in various ways to share or donate or receive electrons from each other until they're as stable as possible. And these basic reactions are the basis for everything that happens in the world. Just as you can write out the chemical formula for water as H2O, Tim James points out in his book Elemental that we can also come up with a basic formula for humans, which I'm not even going to try and say because look how long this is. Later in the book, he even goes on to write that it is a powerful reminder that the atoms that make up our bodies are no different to the atoms that make up the contents of our kitchen. He also wisely points out that a lot of people seem uncomfortable with this notion. Creationists, perhaps? people like Creationists, people like Ken Ham and Kent Hovind and so on, and the people I've covered in a lot of videos, they seem to want to believe that us humans are special in some way, that we're somehow above everything else in the universe, that something separates us from animals or plants or even rocks. And the thing is, we're definitely not. We're fundamentally made up of the same things. We're simply a part of the universe, and that in itself I find amazing. To continue on the theme of quoting Tim, because why not, he also points out that humans are a delicate balance of reactions, which I would argue is true of all living things, not just humans. Also, as a side note, just want to kind of like throw in a quick shout out to Tim James, who, as well as writing the amazing book Elemental, which I really enjoyed, thoroughly recommend, he also has a blog and a thoroughly undersubscribed YouTube channel, which I will link down in the description below. He makes a lot of great videos about kind of like chemistry and science and stuff, and there's this great series he's doing that's like 60-second elements that gives you an overview of a lot of the elements in the periodic table in, you know, a minute. It's really fun, it's really simple and basic, and he puts things in such a straightforward way that someone like me that doesn't specialize in chemistry can like really understand, and I really appreciate that. Also, you know, a huge thank you to him, because I reached out to him when I was making this video and was like, hey, I want to quote your book, can I give you a shout out? And he was like, yeah, of course. Turns out he's like the loveliest guy, so huge thank you to him, and definitely go check out all his stuff. Anyway, back to talking about this delicate balance of chemical reactions. Every one of the 7 life processes that we've spoken about revolves around a series of chemical reactions. You can't escape that. Nutrition involves breaking down and absorbing nutrients. Respiration is a very complex series of reactions that converts glucose and oxygen into water and carbon dioxide, creating energy as a byproduct. Even the concept of sensitivity involves sensory neurons picking up stimuli from the environment, sending signals to the brain via electrical and chemical reactions, and then responding in some way. It's all a series of chemical reactions. So I guess at this point we could say that, okay, well, being alive is defined by a certain set of chemical reactions, but only specific reactions, not just any chemical reaction. So for example, in the human body, when red blood cells are transporting oxygen to the cells, generally a reversible chemical reaction happens where the oxygen combines with the hemoglobin, it carries it to the cells, and then releases it and so on. It's a chemical reaction. It's not, I guess, a central part of respiration, but it's a critical part of it in terms of getting the oxygen where it needs to be for respiration to happen. And therefore, it would be perfectly reasonable to say that this chemical reaction in particular is a sign or a symptom of an organism being alive. However, take another chemical reaction, for example, a combustion reaction like this, and that's not a sign of life, that's just a match being lit. But I mean, what's the difference really? They're both chemical reactions in one way or another, but one of these is associated with a living thing, and one of them is associated with an inanimate object. One is a sign of being alive, and one isn't. And what's the difference, really? I would argue that perhaps the biggest difference is that to be a living thing, you need to be able to do a huge range of chemical reactions simultaneously. And these chemical reactions need to be a part of fulfilling these 7 criteria, either at a cellular level or an organism level, or maybe somewhere in between. It can't just be a single chemical reaction happening somewhere. With lighting a match, for example, you have one chemical reaction happening at a time. In a living thing, you have tons of chemical reactions all happening in tandem. They're all interconnected. Aerobic respiration, for example, isn't just you get some oxygen and you get some glucose and then a little reaction happens and then you get carbon dioxide and water. It's far more complex than that. It's a huge, huge, complicated process with so many steps. You have glycolysis, the citric acid cycle, the electron transport chain. It's not just 2 things in, 2 things out. There are a lot of complex steps to it and a lot of things that need to be in place for, you know, with other things happening in the organism to make everything work and make sure everything gets where it needs to go. So perhaps the difference between living and non-living is simply the level of complexity of chemical reactions. I don't know. It's tough. I mean, that answer is overly simplistic, and it's only one potential answer. But again, it doesn't really make the line between living and non-living any clearer. It's still foggy and complex. But I guess at this point I kind of just have to ask, does it matter where that line is between living and non-living? Actually, yeah, maybe it does because of what we value. So many people view life and being alive as this sacred, special thing. And I'm not saying whether that's right or wrong or not, I'm just saying it's a fact that we as living things, we value life. But the fact is that all living matter is comprised of non-living matter, and as one blogger writes, life itself is simply a product of highly complex chemistry, and the processes of reproduction consist entirely of chemical reactions among non-living atoms. The living organism simply provides the environment in which that chemistry can take place. So perhaps we need to stop thinking of life as such a special thing. Is it really sacred if it's just a bunch of chemical reactions? Maybe the real question shouldn't necessarily be whether something is alive or not, but at what point we start to value that life. Bear with me here, I have a point, and it's not as horrible as it sounds. But if I killed an animal on camera right now, there would probably be uproar, not only in the comments section, not only on the entire internet, but literally everywhere in the news. If I just uploaded me killing an animal to YouTube, people would go crazy. But I'm gonna guess that not many people have a problem with this clip of me killing a dandelion. Why is that? Both would be living things, both are living things, so why do we value one more than the other? Similarly, no one has any problem taking a ton of antibiotics when they're ill, even though that's killing literally millions of living things. Bacteria, but still living things. No one has a problem when they mow the lawn and kill a bunch of living grass cells. No one cares when they scratch their nose and shed a bunch of human living cells. So why do we value some life more than others? If all life is sacred, then why is killing a complex organism like a human so much worse than killing a single-celled organism like a bacteria? And it's not just a matter of numbers either, to say, oh well, a human has more cells to it. Because the amount of bacteria cells that we kill every day through taking antibiotics, through washing our hands, through using disinfectant cleaners, is in the millions and billions. So it's not just a numbers thing. Pro-lifers often use the argument that life begins at conception, but again I have to ask, why is just being alive a good measure of value of an organism? If life beginning is something to treasure, then why aren't those same pro-lifers that protest at abortion clinics also protesting at abattoirs, also protesting when someone cuts down a tree, also protesting when someone washes their hands and kills thousands of bacteria? Why aren't they protesting at hospitals when people are, treating illnesses and killing bacteria and prescribing antibiotics? So perhaps it's not accurate to just say that life is sacred, being alive is sacred, and just to say that life begins at a certain point and therefore, we need to protect it. I don't think that's enough. I think we need to define what it is about certain lives that we value and certain lives that we don't. Life does come from non-life every single day, if you want to use that term. To value living as much as we do is honestly kind of outdated and overly simplistic, and instead maybe we should be focusing on other criteria that kind of gives life more value. For example, consciousness or perception of pain or well-being, and where we draw those lines and how we define them. I'm going to end this here, and I'd really love to hear your thoughts about what you think of the creationist argument of life can't come from non-life. Tell me your thoughts about where you do draw the line, and if you do think it's important to draw that line at all between living and non-living. Tell me what you think about which criteria you think we should be valuing when we talk about life. Is it alive or not, or are there other things you'd rather take into account? For example, heartbeats or consciousness or so on. If you do want to find out more about how life could have arisen from non-life in the first place, we did a really cool episode of the Here and How podcast on abiogenesis, which you might find pretty interesting. If you want to find out more about the life versus individual type debate, check out the collab I did with Holy Kool-Aid on the science of pregnancy and abortion. And don't forget to check out the wonderful Tim James and his website, his blog. He's also here on YouTube. Not only is he an incredibly smart man, but he is absolutely lovely, and, thank you again to him for giving me permission to, use some quotes from his book and stuff in this video. Everything I've spoken about in regards to this is linked down below, along with a few nice, simple, easy-to-read, further reading resources if you want to find out about anything I've spoken about in this video. Yeah, I'm going to end this here. I feel this video maybe got a little bit away from me at the end, and I just kind of ended up rambling. I don't know. Let me know your thoughts. Thank you for watching today. I appreciate you guys so much, and I will see you again soon. Huge thank you to everyone supporting me on Patreon this month, with a special thank you going to Data Jack, Trae Sprowles, Gambit and Chauffeur, Liv's Pantyhose Addiction, Mark Dauner, Christian Berg, Nathalie Romer, Simon Lundh, Jadeon Sheppard, Robert Korte, Peter Kyrouac, Sir Michael Moore, Christina the Atheist, Sage Villarreal, and Loren Hart. You guys and everyone supporting me on Patreon are absolutely amazing, and I couldn't do this without you, so thank you so much. And remember, if you are supporting me on Patreon, you can get exclusive access to my Discord server where you can come join in the conversation. So hopefully I'll see you guys over there. And thank you all so much.